As part of storytelling, that's what we call the storytelling arc. And I'm going to try and break it down as best as I can and in the way I understand. So the first thing is the background or the introduction. You have to set the scene. You have to introduce your character, introduce the environment. This is where you talk about the location of events, where this story happened, what part of the world is happening. So you give your audience some context, like, okay, it happened in 1972 and in the southwest part of England or southwest parts of Nigeria, in this particular village or location or this particular school or among this particular tribe. You talk about maybe the occupation of the character or the background of the young family that is the center of focus of the story. Or if it's your personal story about a place you grew up in, you can talk about the community, talk about what it was like waking up in the morning, the sounds of the birds in the air and the rustling of the trees, all of those kind of things. You try to set the context. Visually speaking, this is where you introduce your wide shots, the wide shot of the environment that talks about what's happening and where it's happening and all of those things. The next thing is to present the challenge. So your story arc goes from the introduction, where you talk about the context, then you talk about the challenge, that is the problem that the main character is going to face. You talk about the crisis point. This is the part that really hooks them in and draws them in. That is the person going to die? Is this story going to end well? Is there going to be a resolution? And you introduce some tension, introduce the thriller effects. What about your story is going to make people really want to watch? Like, introduce a problem, a crisis. Like in one of my videos titled Organize, you can check it out on my channel. I try to use a storytelling format to talk about the fact that my challenge was being organized and how that a disorganized space seemed to affect my creativity and my focus. So somehow in the story, you wonder, what is the conclusion of the matter going to be? Am I going to say that a disorganized space helps me to be creative, or an organized space actually helps me to become more creative? Something like that. The intervention stage in the story arc is where the main challenge in the story, the main problem that you're trying to highlight, the main issue or topic that you want to draw people's attention to, this is where it gets addressed. So if it's a problem, like a negative problem, something that is affecting people or affecting a particular community or your own personal story, this is where the main problem gets addressed. So you could say this is where the solution is brought into play, or this is where the character gets a moment of clarity, where maybe a moment of realization, suddenly you come to this realization or something like that. And then the next stage is the resolution. This is where the character overcomes this challenge, and this is where the story finds its conclusion. So in the example I gave of maybe you're trying to tell a story about J-Town, a community called J-Town. And in story A, like I said, the why or the objective of the story is that you want to draw attention to just make people aware of what it feels like growing up in J-Town. If you follow the story arc, you have the background, the introduction. This is where you talk about J-Town and set the context. And then you find a very creative and compelling way to introduce the problem, which is that it's difficult for children to grow up in J-Town. And then you bring in a moment of tension. This is the climax. This is the crisis. The crisis is that maybe worst case scenario, children are dying, or worst case scenario, the community is not growing or developing because the young people cannot get out and make something of themselves. And then you bring a resolution, which is a moment of clarity, which is that if only people were more aware, or in the case of story B, where you're trying to invite investors, the resolution may be that if they could set up a play area or help people, then maybe there'll be a resolution. Maybe it won't be such a bad thing anymore to be growing up in J-Town, will not be such a bad thing anymore. You could drop your conclusions or recommendations. You could say that you think that J-Town could be better off if you had an investor, or you could say if more people were aware of how difficult it is, who knows, maybe one day somebody will be able to bring something new to the community that will help the people of the community to grow. That's essentially what the story arc looks like. And I try to illustrate this on the screen so you can see just how we've gone around it. So the first thing is the introduction, the background. Then you introduce the challenge, which is the problem that you're trying to address, the problem that you're trying to overcome. Then the crisis. The crisis is where you try to draw the audience, make them emotionally engaged and make them feel like, oh no, something is happening here. something's really happening here. This is really important. This is the moment in the story where somebody says, hey, come and take a look at this. This is really important. I never knew that children in J-Town were facing this kind of situation. I never knew that people were even dying, or I never knew that just $10,000 will make a difference in this community. I think that's a crisis moment. And the resolution is like, what's the way forward? The resolution is that, somehow children find a way, and maybe they find a way because people come and help them, or maybe there's an NGO that set up camp here. There's something that brings about a resolution that makes it such that crisis, that fearful moment, that moment of worry and anxiety, that part in the story that is like, what's going to happen next? This is where whatever is going to happen happens, whether good or bad. And this is where somebody comes to maybe set up an NGO and help the children in the community. This is where an investor maybe comes in to invest in the community and help to address some of the issues, or maybe somebody comes to set up some kind of infrastructure in the place. Resolution is the way forward. Like, now that the intervention has come, look at this is what's happening. Now that people are more aware, and more people are beginning to look at setting up social interventions for the people of J-Town or the children of J-Town, or now that the intervention has come, which is that someone that's come to invest, there's hope for the community. That's the resolution. The resolution could be like, there's hope. The resolution could be like, the problem still lingers and more help is needed. The resolution could be that life has not changed in J-Town. Then the take-home message is the call to action. This is where, like, what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is that we need to make J-Town an example and reach out to other communities where children are having difficulties growing up. Or the take-home message is that just $10,000 or just $1 every day from 10,000 people could change the lives of children in J-Town. That kind of a thing. So this is where you're giving people the take-home message to say, this is what we want you to do. So call to action, hey, now that you've watched my story, what do you think about investing in J-Town? Or now that you've heard my story, maybe you could share this story on social media with other people so that other people get to know what's happening with the children in J-Town, that kind of a thing. That's basically it for the arc, the story arc. Sometimes the reason why it's so hard to talk about storytelling and it's so hard to grasp it, and sometimes you feel like you're not doing enough to incorporate it into your work, is because storytelling requires a lot of reflection. Crafting a story, intentional storytelling, right? Because the interesting thing is that storytelling happens all the time, completely or incompletely. Like, all of these things I'm talking about are just like a framework, a guide. It's not like a hard and fast rule that before you can consider something to be a story, you must check all the boxes and go around the whole arc. Sometimes a story can just be as simple as describing the character, making him interesting, or describing a place or an event. All of those are stories. But the idea around storytelling that I'm sharing, the value in it is just to make us think more about the different elements of stories. And we're talking about stories that are impactful, because there are stories that are just merely entertaining. They're just there to entertain. There are stories that are just there to inform or educate. Whatever it is, those are all different kinds of impact. But if you really want to make your stories impactful and your visual storytelling impactful, you want people to go back and think about your content, then it's good to know these things I'm talking about, even if you're not going to apply them in totality. It's good to know that there's always usually a problem to be addressed, a challenge. There's usually a crisis, a resolution. There's usually a character, and there's usually an emotional element that needs to be incorporated. So I just thought I'd drop it there, just in case this is all a little bit too abstract. Just know that you're not alone in thinking that way. Things can get really abstract when you talk about storytelling. The whole idea is that you just want to create content that resonates with people and makes people feel like they've gotten something, makes a lasting impression, something that you want to remember.